They knew something was coming, but they chose to ignore it. On a quiet Sunday morning, America slept peacefully. No alarms, no warnings, no fear. And then, the sky exploded. This is the story of the warning they missed, and how Pearl Harbor became America's darkest morning. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the island of Oahu awoke gently beneath a soft Hawaiian sun. The air was warm, but not yet heavy, touched by a light breeze that carried the scent of salt and distant flowers. It was a Sunday, the kind that moved slowly. Church bells would soon ring. Families would gather around breakfast tables. Sailors stationed far from home would write letters, promising mothers and sweethearts that they were safe in paradise. In the great natural harbor known as Pearl Harbor, the ships of the United States Pacific Fleet rested quietly at anchor. Battleships lined up along Ford Island in a neat and confident row, massive silhouettes against calm blue water. Among them were the proud giants of American sea power, the USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, and the USS West Virginia. Their steel hulls reflected the early light. On deck, a few sailors moved lazily through routine duties. Some were finishing night watch, others joked about weekend liberty. Nothing about the harbor suggested danger. The Pacific, vast and glittering, seemed like a protective moat separating Hawaii from the troubles of the world. Europe was already at war, and Asia burned with conflict. But here, more than 2,000 miles from the American mainland, war felt distant, abstract, unreal. The United States had not yet entered the global conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had spoken often of aid to allies, of tension with Japan, of embargoes and diplomacy. But for the average serviceman stationed in Hawaii, politics was something discussed in mess halls, not something that would erupt above their heads in flame. Shortly after dawn, colors were raised aboard the ships. The American flag climbed skyward as a bugle call echoed across the water. Sailors stood at attention, some squinting against the sun. It was a ritual repeated countless times before, comforting in its familiarity, a symbol of order, of routine. Beyond the harbor, Honolulu stirred. Streetcars rattled softly along their tracks. A paperboy pedaled his bicycle down a quiet road. At Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, Army Air Corps personnel prepared for another ordinary day of drills and maintenance. Many aircraft sat lined up neatly, wingtip to wingtip, a measure intended to guard against sabotage, not aerial attack. Few expected enemy planes to appear in Hawaiian skies. For weeks, rumors had drifted through military channels. Tensions between the United States and Japan had escalated throughout 1941. American sanctions had cut off vital oil supplies to Japan. Diplomatic negotiations in Washington moved slowly, cautiously. There were whispers that something might happen, perhaps in the Philippines, perhaps in Southeast Asia. But Hawaii? It seemed unlikely. The harbor was considered too shallow for torpedo planes. The distance across the Pacific too immense for a surprise strike. On that Sunday morning, most men believed the greatest danger they faced was boredom. Below deck on the USS Arizona, sailors shuffled through narrow corridors. Some prepared for breakfast, others lingered in bunks, savoring a few extra minutes of sleep. The ship's band was scheduled to play later that morning. Letters, half-written, rested beside cots. Photographs of home were tucked carefully into lockers. For many, Hawaii felt almost like an extended deployment in paradise. Sunshine, palm trees, and the steady rhythm of military life. Above them, the sky remained wide and blue.
A few miles north of Oahu, something moved across that same sky, small dark shapes barely visible against the rising sun. But from the harbor, no one looked in that direction. No alarm sounded. No searchlight swept the horizon. The radar stations on the island had detected unusual signals earlier that morning, but the readings were dismissed as a flight of incoming American B-17 bombers expected from the mainland. It was an assumption, a simple human assumption. Back in the harbor, a chaplain prepared his sermon. He would speak about peace, about faith during uncertain times. Sailors folded clean uniforms for inspection. Coffee steamed in tin mugs. Laughter drifted across the decks. At 7:55 a.m., the illusion of safety shattered. But in the seconds before that moment, those final fragile seconds, Pearl Harbor was still quiet. The water lapped gently against steel hulls. A launch boat hummed lazily across the harbor. A signalman leaned against a railing, scanning a horizon that appeared empty. He might have thought about home, about Christmas approaching, about the strange beauty of palm trees silhouetted against a pale sky. Then came a distant roar. At first it blended with the ordinary sounds of aircraft. Military planes were common in Hawaii, but this sound grew louder, sharper. It did not fade. Men began to look up. Dark shapes descended from the sun, wings flashing red circles, symbols unfamiliar in American skies. Torpedo bombers flew low over the water, so low that their reflections rippled beneath them. Dive bombers tilted downward in steep, terrifying arcs. There is a moment before catastrophe when the mind refuses to understand what the eyes are seeing. Men pointed, some waved, assuming the planes were part of an exercise. Others felt a tightening in their chest, a subtle awareness that something was terribly wrong. The first explosion answered every question. A thunderous blast erupted along Battleship Row as a torpedo struck its target. Water leapt skyward in a violent column. Shock waves rippled across the harbor. Smoke began to rise, dark and unnatural against the morning light. The calm was gone. But the story of that destruction belongs to the chaos that followed. In those minutes before 7:55 a.m., Pearl Harbor existed in a fragile stillness, suspended between peace and war. It was a place of routine, of confidence, of assumptions about distance and safety. It was a harbor filled with men who believed if war came, it would come somewhere else first. They did not know that across the Pacific, a Japanese carrier strike force had sailed in disciplined silence. They did not know that for months strategies had been drawn, rehearsed, perfected. They did not know that history had already turned toward them. Instead, they knew only the warmth of a Hawaiian sunrise, the sound of a bugle, the comfort of steel decks beneath their boots. It is tempting in hindsight to search for warning signs in those quiet hours, to ask who might have known, who might have acted differently. But on that Sunday morning, the world felt stable, predictable. Peace often feels that way, solid and permanent, until the instant it is not. As smoke began to climb into the sky and sirens finally wailed across Oahu, the calm of Pearl Harbor slipped away forever. The harbor that had seemed so distant from danger became the center of it. The island paradise became a battlefield, and the United States, still technically at peace minutes earlier, found itself at war. But just before the storm broke, just before fire consumed steel and oil burned across blue water, there was a quiet Sunday in Hawaii. And in that quiet, history held its breath.
Before the first bombs fell over Hawaii, before smoke darkened the sky above Pearl Harbor,
The path to war had already been laid, slowly, deliberately, and almost quietly. The attack did not erupt from nowhere. It grew from years of suspicion, ambition, miscalculation, and fear. By December 1941, the United States and Japan were no longer simply nations with disagreements. They were powers moving steadily toward a collision neither fully understood, yet neither seemed willing to avoid. In the early 1930s, Japan was a nation transformed. Rapid industrialization had reshaped its economy, but it lacked one crucial resource: oil. Without oil, its navy could not sail, and its air force could not fly. Without raw materials, its factories would stall. As global markets tightened during the Great Depression, Japanese leaders grew convinced that survival required expansion. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria in northern China, establishing a puppet state and signaling its willingness to defy international norms. The world protested, but protests were not bullets, and Japan continued forward. By 1937, full-scale war had erupted between Japan and China. Cities burned, civilians suffered. Reports of atrocities filtered into American newspapers, stirring public outrage. The United States, though officially neutral, increasingly viewed Japan's expansion as a threat, not just to China, but to the balance of power in the Pacific. American businesses had long-standing interests in Asia. So did American missionaries, diplomats, and investors. An aggressive Japan endangered all of it. Yet America in the 1930s was wary of war. The memory of World War I still lingered. Isolationist sentiment ran strong. Many Americans believed the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were shields against foreign conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that the global situation was deteriorating, but he also knew his country was reluctant to intervene directly. Still, policy began to shift. The United States gradually increased economic pressure on Japan. Scrap metal exports were restricted. Aviation fuel shipments were limited. Each sanction was framed as a measured response to aggression. But in Tokyo, these measures felt like strangulation. Japanese leaders viewed access to resources not as a luxury, but as a necessity. If American embargoes tightened further, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt within months. In 1940, Japan aligned itself formally with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy through the Tripartite Pact. The agreement was strategic. If the United States entered the European war, Japan would benefit from Germany's pressure on American resources and attention. For Washington, the alliance confirmed fears that the conflicts in Europe and Asia were merging into something larger, a global war. That same year, Japan moved into French Indochina, expanding its reach deeper into Southeast Asia. The United States responded with sharper economic measures. Then, in July 1941, came the decisive blow. America froze Japanese assets and imposed a near-total oil embargo. For Japan, the embargo was devastating. Roughly 80% of its oil came from the United States. Without access to that supply, Japan had perhaps 18 months before its reserves were exhausted. Military leaders faced a stark choice: retreat from China and Southeast Asia, or seize resource-rich territories such as the Dutch East Indies, knowing that doing so would almost certainly provoke war with the United States. Retreat felt like humiliation. Expansion felt like survival. Meanwhile, diplomatic talks continued in Washington. Japanese envoys met with American officials in an atmosphere thick with mistrust. The United States demanded that Japan withdraw from China and respect the sovereignty of other nations. Japan sought a restoration of trade and recognition of its regional influence. Each side believed it was being reasonable. Each side saw the other as uncompromising. Messages crossed the Pacific in coded language. Intelligence agencies intercepted fragments. Analysts debated their meaning. But even as diplomats spoke of peace, military planners on both sides prepared for war. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, understood America's industrial might. He had studied in the United States. He knew that if war dragged on, Japan could not match American production capacity. His strategy was built on a single, decisive idea: deliver a crippling blow at the outset, shock the United States so thoroughly that it would hesitate, negotiate, perhaps even withdraw from the Pacific. The target would be the heart of American naval power in the region, Pearl Harbor. To many in Tokyo, the plan was audacious, even reckless. The Pacific Ocean was vast. An attack so far from Japan required precision and secrecy. But Yamamoto believed surprise was the only equalizer. If Japan could destroy America's battleships in one sudden strike, it might buy the time needed to secure Southeast Asia's oil fields and fortify a defensive perimeter. In Washington, few believed Japan would risk such a move. American military assessments often assumed that if conflict erupted, it would have been in the Philippines or elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Hawaii seemed distant and secure. Intelligence reports warned of tension, but they lacked clarity about timing or location. Warnings were fragmented, incomplete. Human beings tend to interpret information through expectation. American leaders expected pressure, perhaps even limited skirmishes. They did not expect a full-scale aerial assault on U.S. territory.
Throughout late 1941, signals multiplied. Intercepted communications suggested that negotiations were deteriorating. Japanese diplomats were instructed to destroy sensitive documents. Deadlines were set in coded messages. Yet even as these signs accumulated, the precise nature of Japan's intentions remained obscured by the fog of incomplete intelligence. In Tokyo, the final decision was made in November 1941. If negotiations failed by early December, the attack would proceed. Japanese carrier groups began to assemble in remote northern waters. Pilots trained relentlessly for low-altitude torpedo runs. Crews practiced coordination in silence. The operation required strict radio discipline. Once the fleet departed, it would communicate as little as possible to avoid detection. As the storm force steamed eastward across the Pacific, diplomats in Washington continued to talk. It is one of history's quiet ironies. Even as engines turned and bombs were loaded, both governments still exchanged notes framed in the language of peace. Words moved back and forth across the ocean, while ships moved toward each other beneath it. By early December, negotiations had effectively collapsed. American officials drafted what became known as the Hall Note, outlining firm conditions for restoring relations. To Japanese leaders, it was unacceptable. They interpreted it as an ultimatum. For them, the choice was now clear. War was coming. Yet for ordinary Americans, December 1941 felt uncertain but not catastrophic. Europe dominated headlines. Hitler's armies marched across the continent. Britain endured nightly bombings. In Asia, Japan's war in China seemed distant. Hawaii, with its palm trees and naval parades, appeared secure. The collision course was invisible to most citizens. It existed in policy rooms, in code books, in strategy memoranda. It existed in calculations of oil reserves and industrial output. It existed in fear, fear of encirclement in Tokyo, fear of unchecked aggression in Washington. Neither nation believed itself the aggressor. Each saw its actions as defensive. Japan sought resources it believed essential for survival. The United States sought to deter expansion it believed destabilizing and unjust. When two powers see themselves as defensive while viewing the other as threatening, compromise becomes fragile. By December 6, 1941, Japanese aircraft carriers were less than 300 miles north of Oahu. Their decks were crowded with bombers and fighters prepared for a dawn launch. Pilots reviewed maps and memorized attack patterns. Many wrote final letters home. They understood the risk. Surprise was everything. That same evening in Washington, American intelligence officials worked late decoding diplomatic messages. The final Japanese communication signaled a break in negotiations. It was ominous, but it did not specify where the blow would fall. History often feels inevitable in retrospect, but in those hours, nothing felt inevitable, only tense, suspended. The United States and Japan had moved step by step toward confrontation, each action prompting reaction, each measure narrowing the space for peace. Economic sanctions met military expansion. Diplomatic notes met strategic plans. Pride met fear. And so, before the sun rose over Hawaii on December 7th, before the first engines roared overhead, the true beginning of the attack had already occurred in conference rooms, in embargo policies, in strategy calculations, in assumptions about resolve. The collision was not sudden, it was constructed. When the storm finally broke above Pearl Harbor, it would appear shocking, abrupt, and unimaginable. But beneath that shock lay a decade of rising tension, of choices made under pressure, of leaders convinced they were defending their nation's futures. War, like a storm at sea, does not form in a single moment. It gathers heat, pressure, and momentum long before lightning strikes. By the winter of 1941, the atmosphere between Japan and the United States was charged beyond release. At 7:49 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, a coded message crackled through the radios of Japanese aircraft sweeping south toward Oahu. Tora, Tora, Tora. The phrase signaled complete surprise. The attack had achieved its most critical objective before a single bomb fell. The enemy was unaware. Below them lay Pearl Harbor, still wrapped in the fragile calm of a Hawaiian Sunday morning. Moments earlier, the harbor had been quiet. Sailors aboard the USS Arizona stood at ease after morning colors. Breakfast trays clattered in mess halls. A few men lingered below deck, writing letters or cleaning equipment. On Ford Island, mechanics prepared aircraft for routine maintenance. Nothing in the scene suggested that history was about to split into a before and an after. Then came the sound. At first it was distant, a low mechanical hum blending with the ordinary noise of military aircraft. Hawaii was accustomed to planes overhead. But this sound multiplied. It deepened. It roared. Heads tilted upward. From the direction of the rising sun, dark shapes descended rapidly. They flew low, so low that some skimmed just above the waterline. Torpedo planes moving in disciplined formation. Others climbed higher, preparing to dive. On their wings were red circles, the emblem of the Japanese Empire. For a heartbeat, confusion held the harbor frozen.
Then the first torpedo struck. It slammed into the side of the USS Oklahoma with a violent detonation that sent water exploding into the air. Steel plates buckled, the ship lurched, men were thrown from their feet as alarms finally began to scream. Within seconds, more torpedoes followed. The attackers had trained precisely for this moment, modifying their weapons to function in the relatively shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Torpedo bombers flew in straight, unwavering paths, releasing their payloads with terrifying accuracy. Across Battleship Row, explosions bloomed like dark flowers. The USS West Virginia was struck repeatedly. Smoke poured upward, fire licked at twisted metal. Sailors rushed toward anti-aircraft guns, some still in undershirts, scrambling to load ammunition that had been locked away during peacetime routine. Keys had to be found, storage compartments forced open. Every second mattered. Above, dive bombers tilted downward in steep arcs, their engines screaming. Bombs detached and whistled toward their targets. One tore through the deck of the USS Arizona near 8:06 a.m., penetrating into her forward ammunition magazines. The explosion that followed was catastrophic. A blinding flash erupted from the battleship's bow. The blast lifted the massive vessel as if it were weightless. A towering column of fire and smoke shot hundreds of feet into the sky. Debris rained down across the harbor, burning fragments of steel and shattered bodies. In an instant, more than 1,000 men aboard the Arizona were killed.
The harbor, moments earlier calm and sunlit, was now a furnace. Japanese fighters strafed airfields and decks, machine guns chattering relentlessly. At Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, American aircraft, parked close together to guard against sabotage, became easy targets. Flames consumed rows of planes before many pilots could reach them. On the ground, men ran through smoke and flying shrapnel. Some believed it was an accident at first, perhaps an ammunition mishap, but the red circles overhead left no doubt. This was war. Aboard the USS Oklahoma, sailors struggled desperately as the ship began to list. Torpedoes had torn open her hull. Water flooded in faster than pumps could expel it. Within minutes, she rolled violently onto her side. Men slid across tilting decks. Some leapt into oil-covered water to escape. Others were trapped below, pounding against steel bulkheads as darkness closed around them. The smell of burning fuel spread quickly. Oil leaking from ruptured tanks ignited, turning parts of the harbor into floating infernos. Thick black smoke climbed into the morning sky, visible for miles. Despite the shock, acts of courage unfolded everywhere. Sailors aboard damaged ships formed bucket brigades to fight fires. Medics established makeshift triage stations on docks and beaches. Chaplains moved among the wounded, offering comfort in chaos. Officers shouted commands above the thunder of explosions, trying to restore order in a scene that seemed beyond control. On Ford Island, Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey sprinted to an anti-aircraft position, rallying men to man guns that had not been prepared for immediate use. Ammunition belts jammed, hands shook, but gradually American defenses began to respond. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with bursts of black smoke. Some Japanese planes were hit, spiraling downward into the harbor or crashing into fields. Yet the attackers maintained discipline. They had rehearsed this strike repeatedly in distant waters. Their orders were clear: disable the battleships, cripple American air power, and withdraw before a coordinated defense could form. The first wave consisted of more than 180 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighters. They moved with ruthless precision, targeting capital ships first. Battleships were seen as the backbone of naval strength. If destroyed, the Pacific Fleet would be paralyzed. By 8:10 a.m., Pearl Harbor was almost unrecognizable. The USS California began to settle into the mud beneath the harbor. The USS Nevada attempted to move, her engines straining as she tried to escape the narrow channel. But bombs struck her as well, forcing her to beach herself to avoid blocking the harbor entrance. Smoke darkened the once brilliant Hawaiian sky. The morning sun struggled through layers of ash. The water, once a calm blue mirror, was now slick with oil and debris. For those living through it, time distorted, seconds stretched into eternities. The roar of engines, the crash of detonations, the screams of the wounded blended into a relentless symphony of destruction. In Washington, news of the attack had not yet fully registered. On the mainland, Americans went about their Sunday routines, unaware that their nation had just been thrust into a global war. Back in the harbor, the first wave neared completion. Pilots scanned for remaining targets. Some reported success with cold efficiency. Others glimpsed the scale of devastation below and felt a fleeting awareness of what they had unleashed. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave would begin, but even before it arrived, the damage was staggering. The Arizona burned uncontrollably, flames reaching skyward from her shattered hull. Men trapped below decks suffocated or drowned. Rescue boats moved cautiously through flaming water, pulling survivors from the sea. Many were coated in thick black oil, their uniforms soaked, their faces barely recognizable. One sailor later recalled the sound that lingered most vividly, not the explosions, but the cries for help echoing across the harbor. And yet, amid the horror, resistance stiffened. Guns that had been silent now fired steadily. Coordination improved. Shock turned to determination. The signal, Tora, 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 meant surprise achieved, and indeed surprise had been devastating, but surprise was not the same as victory. The first wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor had accomplished its primary aim, crippling America's battleship fleet and sowing chaos. Yet aircraft carriers, the new instruments of naval power, were not in the harbor that morning. They were at sea, spared from destruction. As Japanese planes turned northward to rejoin their carriers, the harbor smoldered. Fires continued to burn. Rescue operations intensified. Casualty lists began to form. In less than an hour, the illusion of security had been obliterated. What had begun as a quiet Sunday had become one of the most defining moments in American history. The phrase Tora, Tora, Tora would echo far beyond that morning, symbolizing not only tactical surprise, but the end of American isolation. The first wave had struck with precision and fury. It had transformed steel into wreckage and peace into war. And as smoke drifted over the Pacific, the United States stood stunned, but not broken, on the edge of a conflict that would reshape the world. By the time the first wave of Japanese aircraft began to pull away from Oahu, the sky above Pearl Harbor was already thick with smoke. Oil burned on the surface of the harbor, turning the blue Pacific into a black, flaming mirror. The shattered hull of the USS Arizona continued to erupt in bursts of fire, her forward section engulfed in an inferno that could be seen for miles. But the attack was not over. At approximately 8:54 a.m., the second wave arrived. If the first wave had relied on shock and torpedoes, the second came with altitude and bombs. More than 160 additional aircraft,
dive bombers and fighters swept in from multiple directions. Their objective was to complete the destruction, target airfields, strike remaining ships, and ensure that the Pacific Fleet would be unable to mount an immediate counterattack. By now, there was no confusion, no hesitation. The man on the ground and at sea understood exactly what was happening. The United States was under attack. Anti-aircraft guns thundered from ships and shore batteries alike. Black bursts of flak began to dot the sky in greater numbers. Sailors who had never fired their weapons in combat aimed desperately at fast-moving silhouettes diving from the sun. Some gunners stood barefoot on hot steel decks. Others fired until their ears rang and their shoulders bruised from recoil. On Ford Island, smoke reduced visibility to a choking haze. Shrapnel clattered across metal hangars. Aircraft that had survived the first wave were now prime targets. Dive bombers tilted downward in steep, terrifying plunges, releasing bombs that screamed as they fell. At Hickam Field, explosions tore through barracks and maintenance buildings. Concrete shattered, windows imploded. Medics scrambled across open ground under strafing fire to reach the wounded. What had been orderly rows of American planes were now twisted wreckage, burning where they stood. In the harbor, the battleships that had not yet sunk struggled to survive. The USS Nevada had managed to get underway during the first assault, her engines pushing her slowly toward the harbor entrance. Her captain understood the danger. If she sank in the channel, she would trap the entire fleet inside. As bombs rained down around her, the Nevada pressed forward, anti-aircraft guns blazing. Japanese pilots quickly recognized the threat. A moving battleship was both a symbol and a target. Dive bombers focused their attack on her decks. Several bombs struck, igniting fires and causing severe damage. Realizing she could not safely reach open water, the Nevada was deliberately beached to prevent sinking in the channel. Her crew continued firing even as flames spread. Nearby, the USS Pennsylvania, stationed in dry dock, became another focal point. Bombs struck the dock area, damaging the ship and nearby destroyers. Workers and sailors alike were caught in the blast waves, thrown against steel and concrete. Amid the chaos, individual acts of courage multiplied. Ensign Herbert C. Jones aboard the USS California directed the loading of anti-aircraft ammunition even after being mortally wounded. Chief Petty Officer Peter Tomich remained at his post below deck on the USS Utah, ensuring that boilers were secured before the ship capsized, sacrificing his own chance to escape. Across the harbor, unnamed sailors dove repeatedly into burning oil to rescue shipmates, ignoring the risk of suffocation or explosion. The water itself became an enemy. Oil spread thick across the surface, clinging to skin and clothing. Fires ignited it in rolling waves. Survivors who leapt overboard to escape sinking ships found themselves swimming through flame. Some used debris as makeshift rafts. Others pulled unconscious comrades toward shore. The second wave intensified this nightmare. Fighter planes strafed decks, targeting exposed gunners and medical crews. The staccato rhythm of machine gun fire echoed between hills surrounding the harbor. Concrete piers splintered, telephone lines went dead, communications faltered.
And yet, resistance hardened. American gunners grew more accurate as the minutes passed. Coordination improved. Officers barked orders with grim determination. Ammunition, once locked away as a peacetime precaution, was now distributed rapidly. Civilian workers joined the defense effort, carrying shells and assisting the wounded. The sky became a deadly arena of motion. Japanese aircraft diving and banking, American flak bursting in black clouds, smoke spiraling upward in thick columns. By now,
The element of total surprise had faded. The first wave had achieved shock. The second faced defiance. Still, the destruction continued. The USS Oklahoma lay capsized, her hull exposed like a wounded animal. Trapped sailors inside pounded on steel walls, signaling their survival in faint rhythmic knocks. Rescue teams would work for days to free some of them. Others would not be reached in time. The USS West Virginia burned fiercely, but remained partially afloat, thanks to quick counterflooding measures by her crew. Damage control teams fought fires in suffocating conditions, crawling through smoke-filled compartments to prevent further catastrophe. At 9:20 a.m., the intensity of the second wave began to diminish. Japanese pilots, having expended most of their ordnance, turned northward. Some aircraft were missing. American defenses had improved. Several attackers had been shot down. Smoke trailed from damaged planes as they retreated toward their carriers. The harbor was left in ruin. 8 battleships had been damaged. 4 were sunk or capsized. Nearly 200 American aircraft were destroyed. More than 2,400 Americans would be dead by day's end. But amid the devastation, something else had emerged: resolve. In the immediate aftermath, as the final Japanese planes disappeared over the horizon, sirens continued to wail. Fires burned uncontrolled. The air reeked of cordite and fuel. Yet sailors returned to their stations. Officers organized search parties. Chaplains moved among the injured. Nurses worked without pause. Rumors spread quickly. Another wave might be coming. Paratroopers might land. Invasion forces could appear offshore. Defensive positions were manned across Oahu. Soldiers prepared for a ground assault that never came. Throughout the morning, rescue operations intensified. Men trapped inside overturned hulls were located by the faint tapping of tools against metal. Cutting torches burned through steel in desperate attempts to reach them. Some survivors were freed after hours in darkness. Others succumbed before help could arrive. The second wave had intended to finish what the first began. It had struck airfields and ships with ruthless efficiency. Yet it had also revealed something the planners in Tokyo had underestimated: the speed with which Americans adapted under fire. Despite catastrophic losses, the Pacific Fleet was not annihilated. Critical infrastructure, including fuel storage facilities and repair yards, remained largely intact. Aircraft carriers, absent that morning, survived untouched. In less than 90 minutes, Pearl Harbor had transformed from a symbol of American naval confidence into a scene of twisted steel and human tragedy. The second wave ensured that the wounds were deep. But the fight for survival did not end with the retreating aircraft. It continued in hospital wards where doctors operated without rest. It continued in shipyards where damaged vessels would be raised and repaired. It continued in factories thousands of miles away where production lines would soon accelerate beyond anything the world had seen. The phrase "fire and steel" described more than the bombs and bullets of that morning. It described the test of endurance faced by every man and woman caught in the attack. The second wave sought to crush resistance. Instead, it ignited determination. As smoke drifted across Oahu and the fires slowly came under control, the reality settled heavily upon the island and soon upon the nation. The United States was at war, and though Pearl Harbor had been battered by fire and torn by steel, it had not surrendered. The fight for survival had only begun. By late morning on December 7th, 1941, the smoke that had choked the skies above Pearl Harbor began to drift and thin, revealing the full scope of destruction. The deafening roar of bombs and machine gun fire had faded,
replaced by a heavy, eerie silence. It was a silence unlike any the harbor had known, a silence that carried the weight of more than 2,000 lives lost, countless injuries, and an infrastructure crippled in mere hours. The calm that had marked the Sunday morning of December 7th was gone forever, replaced by ash, debris, and stunned disbelief. From the air, the harbor resembled a battlefield from another era, yet the scene was eerily modern. Steel warships, once gleaming and proud, now lay listing or partially submerged. The USS Arizona had been utterly destroyed, its massive forward magazines detonating in a single devastating explosion. Flames continued to lick her broken decks as oil-coated water burned around her hull. Men trapped below were unreachable. The ship had become a tomb. Across the harbor, the USS Oklahoma had capsized, a steel giant turned on its side, entombing hundreds more inside. The USS West Virginia and USS California were heavily damaged but afloat, fires smoldering across their decks. Smaller vessels, destroyers and cruisers had been overturned, blown apart, or sunk at anchor. The once familiar skyline of Pearl Harbor, framed by Oahu's lush hills, was now marred by smoke plumes and twisted metal. Buildings at Ford Island, Hickam Field, and Wheeler Field were crumpled by bombs. Rows of American aircraft had been destroyed, strafed, or set aflame by Japanese fighters. The sun that had bathed the island in morning warmth now filtered through smoke, casting a pale gray light over the carnage. On the docks, survivors worked feverishly to pull the injured from water and wreckage. Some had jumped overboard during the attack, swimming through a deadly mix of floating oil, flaming debris, and shattered wood. Medics and sailors treated wounds ranging from minor burns to catastrophic injuries. The wounded screamed for help, some in shock, some in pain, some calling out for comrades who were never to be found. Many corpses still floated in the water or clung to the sides of overturned ships. Rescue teams, working in shifts, often had to ignore bodies to reach those they could save, a grim calculus of survival. Communication networks had been shattered, telephone lines lay severed among smashed poles, telegraph equipment and radios were partially destroyed, making coordination difficult. Officers shouted orders across smoke-filled docks and damaged ships. The chaos of the morning had given way to methodical efforts to regain control. Amid the disaster, remarkable discipline emerged. Teams formed to put out fires, secure ammunition, and ensure that fuel depots were not ignited, preventing further catastrophe.
For those in Washington, D.C., the first reports were fragmented, garbled, and almost unbelievable. Pearl Harbor attacked, the cables said. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his aides pored over incoming communications, trying to piece together what had happened across the vast Pacific. The numbers of casualties, the loss of battleships, the destruction of aircraft, none of it was yet fully understood, but the gravity was undeniable. This was an act of war. The United States, previously at peace with Japan, had been thrust into global conflict in a single morning. Meanwhile, survivors continued to work in grim conditions. The stench of smoke, oil, and burning fuel was overwhelming. Sailors combed through the remains of their ships, calling names, searching compartments for trapped crewmates. Some were pulled from the water hours after the attack, shivering, soaked, and coated in thick black oil. Others had been rescued just minutes before fatal explosions, their survival a combination of luck, skill, and courage. In the midst of the horror, acts of heroism became apparent. Medics ran into burning buildings and ships to rescue the wounded. Sailors and Marines improvised stretchers, forming chains to move the injured across debris-littered docks.
Chaplains offered comfort, reading prayers to men whose world had suddenly ended. One by one, individuals faced the unimaginable and acted with resolve that defied despair. These stories, though overshadowed by the scale of the disaster, would endure in testimonies, letters, and memoirs for decades to come. The human toll was staggering. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. Nearly 1,200 were wounded. Among the fallen were entire crews of battleships like the USS Arizona. Some never recovered. Families across the United States would soon learn of the loss, grief arriving in telegrams and letters that were impossible to comprehend. Communities in Hawaii were traumatized, not just by the loss of life, but by the sheer violence brought to their doorsteps. Economically and militarily, the damage was severe. 8 battleships were damaged, 4 sunk or capsized. Nearly 100 aircraft had been destroyed, along with hangars and repair facilities. Oil storage tanks were ablaze or punctured. Yet crucial infrastructure, shipyards, fuel depots, and repair facilities remained intact. This would prove essential in the weeks and months to come, allowing the United States to recover faster than Japanese planners had anticipated. In the ash and smoke, a strange calm began to take hold. For those who survived the immediate attack, the silence of the afternoon was almost surreal. The worst had passed, yet the threat remained. Everyone knew Japan could strike again, and fears of invasion spread through Oahu. Soldiers fortified defensive positions, while civilians were instructed to remain vigilant. Boats patrolled the harbor, searching for mines or lingering enemy submarines. Air raid sirens were tested repeatedly. In the midst of devastation, America was learning to fight back. In Honolulu, the local population tried to comprehend what had occurred. Families counted missing sons and husbands. The city itself had suffered only lightly, but the psychological shock was profound. Newsreels, newspapers, and radio reports would soon bring the horror of Pearl Harbor into every home across the mainland, ensuring that the images of ash, steel, and broken lives would be forever etched in memory. For the men still alive aboard damaged ships, the task was immediate: stabilize, recover, and prepare. Damage control parties worked all crock to pump water from hulls, fight residual fires, and salvage what equipment could be saved. Sailors improvised tools, reinforced bulkheads, and transported supplies across dangerous, smoke-filled decks. These efforts, often overshadowed in history by the attack itself, were critical in preventing further losses and enabling the Pacific Fleet to eventually return to operational strength. As evening fell over the island, the harbor glowed with burning oil patches, flames reflected in the calm, blackened waters. The soundscape shifted from explosions to the crackling of fire, the groaning of metal, and the occasional distant call for help. Rescue and recovery teams worked tirelessly, often guided by memory or intuition, since maps, radios, and lighting were limited. The remnants of ships stood like skeletal monuments, silent witnesses to the morning that had changed history. It was in this aftermath that the character of the United States began to show. Leaders, military and civilian alike, faced the scale of destruction and recognized the inevitability of response. For ordinary men and women, survival had become the first imperative, but rebuilding, resisting, and retaliating would soon follow. In the midst of ash and silence, a nation began to awaken. Even in the quiet hours after the attack, the lessons of that morning became clear. Preparedness could never be assumed. Peace could vanish in a heartbeat. Heroism was scattered among the living and the dead. And yet the human capacity for resilience, courage, and adaptation revealed itself in ways that would inspire the country in the coming struggle. By the close of the day, Pearl Harbor remained smoldering, wounded but not broken.
The harbor, once a symbol of America's military strength and tranquility, now stood as a somber reminder of vulnerability, mortality, and the sudden transformative power of war. In the aftermath of fire, steel, and silence, America faced a stark choice: despair or mobilization. History would see that the choice made that day set the United States on a path towards total engagement in the global conflict that defined the 20th century.
The morning of December 7, 1941, had ended in fire, smoke, and ruin. But by the following day, the United States was no longer a nation caught by surprise. It was a nation in motion. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, confronted with the shocking destruction of Pearl Harbor and the staggering loss of more than 2,400 American lives, prepared to address the nation. The words he would speak later that evening would echo through history, shaping not only policy, but the very identity of a country suddenly at war. In the White House, Roosevelt reviewed telegrams and intelligence reports, the reality of the attack unfolding in meticulous detail. Battleships had been sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, entire units of sailors and airmen killed or wounded. Hawaii, long perceived as a distant outpost, had become the front line of a conflict the United States had until then only watched from afar. Cabinet members, military advisors, and aides gathered around Roosevelt, their faces tense but resolute. The question was no longer what happened, it was what will we do now? By mid-morning, news of the attack reached the continental United States. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and telegrams delivered fragments of information that were initially chaotic and incomplete. Families waited anxiously for word of loved ones stationed at Pearl Harbor. The nation's mood was a mix of disbelief, grief, and anger. Many Americans struggled to comprehend that a peaceful Sunday in Hawaii could erupt into such sudden violence, so far from home, yet so intimately connected to the country's sense of security. In the Congress, members convened urgently, already aware that decisive action was required. Military officers briefed lawmakers on the extent of the damage, the potential for further attacks, and the current status of Pacific defenses. While most of the ships could eventually be repaired and aircraft replaced, the psychological impact of the attack was profound. The illusion of invulnerability had been shattered. The United States was exposed, vulnerable, and under direct assault. That evening, December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. His voice, calm yet resolute, carried across the chamber and into the homes of millions of Americans listening on radios. He described the attack in detail, emphasizing that the Japanese had struck without warning, without provocation, and with ruthless efficiency. Then came the words that would resonate across generations. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt's speech was more than a declaration of outrage. It was a call to unity, a recognition of the gravity of the moment, and a signal that the United States would respond. Congress listened intently. Members of both parties, leaving behind the divisions of peacetime politics, understood that national survival demanded action. The President detailed the events in Hawaii, emphasizing the courage of sailors, airmen, and civilians who had faced the attack with extraordinary bravery. He also underscored the calculated nature of the assault, highlighting that Japan had planned it meticulously and that it was designed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. As Roosevelt spoke, Americans across the country reacted. In homes, factories, and offices, men and women listened in silence, absorbing the shock and forming their own resolve. Young men prepared to enlist. Women began organizing support efforts for families and servicemen. Communities mobilized quickly, knowing that the nation was entering a war that would require extraordinary effort, sacrifice, and determination.
Congress acted swiftly. The Senate and House of Representatives debated for only a brief time before passing a formal declaration of war. The votes were nearly unanimous, with only one dissenting senator opposing the motion. The United States had officially entered World War II. Roosevelt signed the declaration, cementing the nation's commitment to respond to the aggression and to defend itself, its territories, and its allies. Across the country, military installations accelerated readiness. Bases prepared troops for deployment. Factories converted to war production. Shipyards increased output of vessels and aircraft. The nation's industrial capacity, previously focused on civilian goods, now shifted to weapons, armor, and supplies essential to a global conflict. The response was comprehensive, not merely military, but social, economic, and cultural. Back in Hawaii, survivors and rescuers continued to work tirelessly. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Damaged ships were stabilized, their crews maintaining defensive positions even while tending to those injured. Local civilians assisted in every possible way, from transporting supplies to aiding in recovery operations. Despite exhaustion, morale remained strong. The sense of duty and solidarity became a powerful force amid the devastation. The attack also prompted a reassessment of military strategy. Naval and Army leaders evaluated vulnerabilities, noting the surprising effectiveness of carrier-based aircraft and torpedo tactics. Radar and intelligence systems were scrutinized. Plans were quickly developed to ensure that future attacks could be detected earlier and met with coordinated responses. Lessons from that morning would shape the U.S. military for the entirety of the Pacific War. On the diplomatic front, the United States severed relations with Japan completely. Embassies and consulates were instructed to close, and Japanese nationals in America faced heightened scrutiny. Allies in Europe and Asia recognized the shift. A previously neutral America had now fully committed to the war. Communications channels between the U.S. government and other nations became vital in coordinating responses, supply lines, and strategic objectives. In the following days, Americans across the nation engaged in acts both large and small, all reflecting a determination to persevere. Young men enlisted in record numbers, eager to serve. Factories accelerated production of tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels. Communities organized bond drives to fund the war effort. Schools and civic organizations held educational programs to inform the public about rationing, civil defense, and preparedness. The attack at Pearl Harbor had not only galvanized the military, but had transformed the social and cultural fabric of the country. While the shock of the attack lingered, Americans also drew strength from the heroism displayed during the assault. Stories circulated of sailors who had manned anti-aircraft guns under fire, medics who rescued the wounded from burning ships, and ordinary citizens who improvised to save lives and preserve critical infrastructure. These acts became symbols of resilience and courage, reinforcing the message that the nation would endure and respond with determination. By the end of December 8th, the United States was fully mobilized. Every branch of the military, every layer of government, and countless civilians contributed to the collective effort. Roosevelt's speech and Congress's declaration marked the turning point. The nation was no longer a spectator. Pearl Harbor had shocked, devastated, and angered America, but it had also ignited an unwavering resolve. In the weeks and months that followed, the American people would remember that day with clarity. December 7th became more than a date on the calendar. It became a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience. Lessons learned from the attack shaped military strategy, inspired innovation in technology, and fostered a sense of unity and purpose across the nation. The words, "a date which will live in infamy," were not merely a reflection on tragedy, they were a promise. The United States would honor the fallen, respond to aggression, and ultimately ensure that the nation would emerge from the shadow of that Sunday morning stronger, united, and committed to defending freedom. The attack on Pearl Harbor had inflicted death and destruction, but it had also forged an American identity resolute in its determination. Out of ash, fire, and silence arose a nation ready to confront the challenges of total war. And from that moment onward, the United States would respond not with hesitation, but with relentless action, courage, and an unbreakable will.
The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was more than a single catastrophic event. It became a defining moment that shaped the trajectory of the United States in the 20th century. Beyond the immediate loss of life and destruction of ships, aircraft, and infrastructure, Pearl Harbor left a legacy of courage, reflection, and determination that resonated throughout the war and beyond. The lessons learned that day would influence military strategy, diplomacy, and national identity for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath, the human cost was overwhelming. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, more than 1,000 wounded, and countless others traumatized by the horrors they had witnessed. Families across the nation mourned the loss of sons, fathers, brothers, and friends. Sailors and airmen who survived carried both physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. The sheer scale of destruction was unprecedented. Battleships such as the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma were destroyed or capsized. Hundreds of aircraft lay in ruins, and entire naval facilities were rendered unusable. Yet, amid this devastation, a remarkable spirit of resilience emerged. The first lesson Pearl Harbor taught the United States was the critical importance of preparedness and intelligence. Despite numerous warnings and intercepted Japanese communications, American military leaders had underestimated the likelihood of an attack on Hawaii. The catastrophic surprise emphasized that complacency, even during peacetime, could be deadly. In response, the U.S. military implemented sweeping reforms in intelligence, communications, and early warning systems. Radar networks were expanded, cryptography and code breaking received unprecedented attention, and inter-service coordination improved dramatically. These lessons would prove essential in the battles to come across the Pacific, where speed, precision, and anticipation would often determine victory or defeat. Another lesson lay in the evolving nature of warfare. Pearl Harbor demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of carrier-based air power and precision bombing. Battleships, once considered the backbone of naval strength, were vulnerable to coordinated aerial assaults. This realization reshaped naval strategy, pushing the United States Navy to prioritize aircraft carriers, fast attack groups, and air superiority. The lessons learned from the Harbor attack directly influenced the planning and execution of key Pacific battles, including the Battle of Midway and the island-hopping campaigns that eventually brought Allied forces closer to Japan. Beyond strategy and technology,
Pearl Harbor had a profound impact on American society. The attack galvanized a nation that had been divided over intervention in foreign conflicts. Isolationist sentiment, strong in the late 1930s and early 1940s, evaporated almost overnight. Americans of all backgrounds, young and old, men and women, soldiers and civilians, rallied behind a common purpose: to defend their nation and ensure that such devastation could never happen again. Recruitment soared, factories shifted to wartime production, and citizens contributed to rationing, bond drives, and civil defense programs. Pearl Harbor transformed the American home front into an essential component of total war.
The psychological impact of the attack also created a shared national memory that would endure for generations. December 7th became synonymous with both tragedy and heroism. Stories of bravery, sailors who manned anti-aircraft guns under fire, medics who risked their lives to save the wounded, civilians who assisted in rescue operations were immortalized in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and later in books and films. The narrative of Pearl Harbor reinforced a sense of unity, courage, and duty that became a cornerstone of American identity during World War II and beyond. In terms of international relations, Pearl Harbor reshaped the global stage. The United States' entry into World War II altered the balance of power. Its industrial capacity, vast resources, and military potential became decisive factors in the eventual defeat of the Axis powers. Moreover, the attack served as a stark warning to other nations of the consequences of underestimating American resolve. Diplomatic strategies were recalibrated, alliances strengthened, and the United States assumed a more prominent leadership role in shaping post-war international order. Pearl Harbor, once seen as a symbol of vulnerability, became a catalyst for American engagement and influence on the global stage. Pearl Harbor also left a tangible legacy in terms of memory and commemoration. Memorials, museums, and historical sites preserve the events of December 7th, ensuring that future generations understand the cost of war and the importance of vigilance. The USS Arizona Memorial, built over the sunken battleship, stands as a solemn tribute to those who lost their lives, a reminder that history is not abstract, but personal, lived, and remembered. Educational programs and annual ceremonies reinforce the lessons learned, honoring bravery while highlighting the ongoing relevance of preparedness, strategy, and national unity. The attack also prompted critical reflection on the use of intelligence and the balance of diplomacy with military readiness. Questions about missed warnings and the decisions of military and political leaders prompted reforms in strategic planning. The establishment of integrated intelligence communities, such as the eventual creation of the Central Intelligence Agency and the strengthening of the Department of Defense and State Department, were partly shaped by the hard-earned lessons of that Sunday morning. Pearl Harbor underscored that knowledge, foresight, and communication are as essential to national security as firepower. Moreover, Pearl Harbor highlighted the importance of adaptability and resilience. Despite initial devastation, the United States recovered quickly. Damaged ships were repaired, sunk vessels were salvaged, and air power was replenished. Military strategies evolved in real time, drawing on lessons learned during the attack. The ability to adapt under pressure became a defining characteristic of the American war effort. The recovery demonstrated that while destruction can be swift, rebuilding, when driven by determination, resources, and collective effort, can be even faster and more effective. Finally, the legacy of Pearl Harbor extends beyond military and strategic lessons. It shaped a national narrative that celebrates courage, honors sacrifice,
and emphasizes the importance of learning from history. The phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," continues to resonate not merely as a recollection of tragedy, but as a symbol of national resolve and the enduring consequences of vigilance. Pearl Harbor reminds us that the cost of unpreparedness is high, but the capacity of a determined nation to respond, recover, and prevail is even higher. As the United States pressed forward in World War II, the lessons of Pearl Harbor guided every major engagement in the Pacific. Officers who survived the attack drew on their first-hand experiences to make strategic decisions. Pilots, sailors, and soldiers carried the memory of lost comrades into battle, their actions infused with the urgency and gravity of that December morning. The recovery and eventual victory in the Pacific were built on the foundation of lessons learned in ash, fire, and smoke. Lessons that shaped the modern American military and secured the nation's place as a global power. In retrospect, Pearl Harbor stands as a moment of both profound tragedy and remarkable transformation. Its legacy is measured not only in lives lost or ships destroyed, but in the enduring vigilance, courage, and unity it inspired. From the ruins of that fateful morning arose an America more resilient, more prepared, and more determined to defend freedom. The road to victory was long and costly, but Pearl Harbor forged the resolve that carried the nation through World War II and beyond, ensuring that the memory of December 7th would live not only in infamy, but also in triumph, remembrance, and lessons for all time.